Welcome to Talk 8 in our series where I'm reflecting on the goodness of God throughout my life. I left school in December 1956 and started my course at Oxford in October 1959, a period of almost 3 years. In many ways it seemed a long time to wait, but in the plan and purpose of God they turned out to be highly significant years. I gained experience in teaching. I met Eileen, the girl who was to be my lifelong partner, and I received the life-changing experience of the baptism in the Holy Spirit. But first, I need to explain how I got my place at Oxford and why I had to wait 3 years before taking it up. In 1956, at the age of 17, I'd already passed my A-levels and had decided to stay on at school a further year to take S-levels the following summer. S-levels, the S stands for scholarship, were the highest level of GCE exams that you could take and were designed to support your application to university, especially if you were hoping to go to Oxford or Cambridge. However, as things turned out, I didn't need to complete my S-level course because in the first term of that school year, I was awarded a scholarship to read philosophy, politics and economics at Brasenose College, Oxford. Our form master, Mr. Rennie, had suggested that some of us might like to spend a few days in Oxford and take some examinations at Brasenose College with a view to obtaining a place there. As there was only one place available, I was not expecting to get it, but I decided to go, even though my friend John Bramble was going too, and I thought he was far more likely to be successful. He'd always come higher than me in class and had gained better A-level results than I had. There were about 8 of us altogether, each of us taking different exam papers, generally depending on what subjects we'd taken at A-level. There was just one paper that was the same for all of us, an English essay, the title of which was unknown to us until we sat down in the examination room. And that title was Words. The length of that exam was 3 hours, and although some boys started writing almost immediately, I spent the first 45 minutes planning my essay. I can't remember in great detail the contents of that essay, but I know that I concluded it by talking about Christ, the Word made flesh, the divine Logos, the ultimate revelation of God himself. I've sometimes wondered if the reason I was awarded the scholarship rather than any of my colleagues was that the Lord was honouring me because I had honoured him. Of course, I can't be sure about that, but he had helped me through my A-levels, and, as I've told you before, when I had honoured him before the whole class, when my history master had told me that I was likely to fail, and I have always sought to give God the glory for any academic success I may have achieved. And I discovered later that of all the papers I sat during that visit to Brasenose, that essay on words was awarded the highest grade, an alpha. But when I received a letter from Brasenose offering me a scholarship a few weeks later, I was totally amazed and, after discussing it with my father, came to the conclusion that this had to be God. But there was just one problem. The place they were offering me was for 3 years later, in October 59, after I'd completed my 2 years national service. However, the government had already agreed to abolish national service and were in the progress of phasing it out gradually. They did this by delaying the call-up, which meant, in my case, that by the time they would have called me up, there would be less than 2 years before my course at Oxford was starting. In short, I wouldn't have time to do national service, and by the time I had finished my course at Oxford, national service had been completely abolished. So, having obtained my place at Oxford, I decided to leave school at the end of term in December and start to earn some money. And at the time, there was a great shortage of school teachers, as a result of which young people who had passed their A-levels could do uncertificated teaching before going to university. And so I ended up doing almost 3 years teaching before I went to Oxford. And surprisingly enough, it started at the very school I just left. Or to be more precise, it was at the preparatory school attached to Brentwood and standing just on the other side of the main playing field. One of the teachers was on sickness leave for a few weeks, and I was asked if I would take their place, as they taught French and Latin, which were, of course, my two main A-level subjects. As it was a boarding school, I was required to live in and be the housemaster for some of the boys, which mainly involved making sure that they were in bed on time and not talking after a certain time. I was only there for a few weeks, January the 15th to February the 16th to be precise, but I enjoyed the experience very much and learnt a great deal, not least of which was that if you prepared your lessons thoroughly, you had relatively few problems with discipline. After Brentwood Prep, I was told by the Essex Education Committee that another job was available in Brentwood at the Church of England Primary School in Copfold Road, only a few hundred yards from my old school. A teacher was on maternity leave and a replacement was needed until July to look after her class of 8 to 9-year-olds. The pay wasn't great as I wasn't a qualified teacher. It worked out at about half what I would have been paid if I'd been qualified. And of course, this wasn't a residential post, so I needed to travel on 2 buses each day to get there from Hornchurch. But I accepted the job anyway. As in most primary schools, a teacher was responsible for teaching their class throughout the day all the subjects on the timetable. That wasn't a problem, but learning to keep discipline was another matter. My expectations were based on the level of discipline I'd experienced as a pupil at Brentwood and the few weeks I spent teaching at Brentwood Prep. Copfold Road was quite another matter. Many of the children came from a less fortunate background, and some of them were of rather limited intelligence. As a result, and due to my own lack of training and experience, and lack of any supervision, I found the 2 terms I was in charge of that class extremely difficult. I was quite relieved when I heard towards the end of the summer term that Mrs. Eisted, the teacher who'd been on maternity leave, was returning the following Monday. So, on the Friday before she was due to return, I was clearing my desk after school when the headmaster, Dr. Ward, asked me what I was doing, adding, "You're not leaving, are you?" And he offered to give me a different class to teach and keep me on indefinitely until I went up to Oxford. So I decided to stay, and as things turned out, I was there until the end of September 1959. My ability to keep discipline improving greatly with the experience and the help of a day school teachers' conference organised by the Baptist Union and held at St Augustine's College, Canterbury in 1957. As I look back on those years of teaching before I went to Oxford, I think I can see why God allowed it to happen that way. While I was waiting, I was rather frustrated, thinking, why am I teaching when God has called me to the ministry? But little did I know then that his plan for me was that most of my ministry would be teaching. And although the major part of my teaching ministry has been to a different age group, even when teaching at degree level in Bible colleges around the world, I've found that God has given me the ability to teach at a level that everyone can understand, something I repeatedly hear from grateful listeners. And perhaps at least part of that ability is a result of those years I spent teaching less able children while waiting to go to university. God knows what he's doing, and he always has a purpose in what appear to us to be pointless pauses in our lives. But that brings me to an even more significant purpose in those years of waiting, for it was in those years that I met Eileen, the girl I was to marry, and who was to be the ideal person to support me in my ministry. It was an incredibly hot day that Saturday afternoon. So hot, in fact, that the railway line buckled in the heat of the sun. It was Saturday the 29th of June 1957, and we had arranged a youth rally where the young people from Elm Park Baptist would meet up with Hornchurch Baptist young people for fun and games in the park, followed by an open-air service. Although the churches were only 2 miles apart, before then we'd had little contact with them, so I actually knew none of the young people there. People have often asked me how I met Eileen, and I've usually replied, in the park. After a game of rounders, we sat down in groups and had a picnic tea. I noticed a group of 4 rather attractive girls sitting a few yards away and thought I'd like to take a closer look. So I got up and walked towards them and happened to notice that one of them had taken her shoes off. On impulse, I picked up one of the shoes and ran off with it, with nothing in particular in mind other than just having a bit of fun. Needless to say, the owner of the shoe ran after me, but was at something of a disadvantage as she had bare feet. I soon disappeared from view and hid the shoe under the bridge that spanned the park lake. Of course, when she eventually caught up with me, I felt a bit of an idiot and showed her where the shoe was. We got into conversation, and I asked her if she'd like to come to our Saturday evening youth club, which took place after the open-air service. She agreed, and after sharing a song sheet at the open air, I found out that her name was Eileen, and that she was just 6 days older than me. After youth club, I walked her home, and kissed her good night. And that was the beginning of a relationship that lasted, with a short break, for 67 years, and which ended only when the Lord called her home at the age of 85. We agreed to meet again sometime the following week, but the next day, after attending church in the morning, I decided to go to Hornchurch Baptist for their evening service in the hope of seeing Eileen again. She and her friend were sitting in the choir, and her friend noticed me in the congregation and said to Eileen, "He's here." After the service, we went for a long walk in the park, and from then on were to see each other just about every day. I discovered that Eileen had attended Romford County High School and had left after taking her O-levels. At the time, she was working at Bart's, that's St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, but a year later she accepted a post in the Dagenham Education Office, which was closer to home. But before that, I have to confess that there was a short break in our relationship during the last few months of 1957. I mentioned earlier that I attended a conference in Canterbury during the last week in August of that year. Everyone there was a qualified school teacher, with the exception of me and one other person, a girl called Eileen, who was the same age as me and had been accepted to train as a teacher at the Chelsea College for Physical Education in Eastbourne. Eileen was extremely attractive, highly intelligent, and very good at sport. She was nearly good enough to beat me at table tennis. But she was having doubts about her faith, and I spent some time with her trying to encourage her. As a result, we were both very attracted to each other, and, to cut the story short, because I have never been proud of myself about this, we started to see each other after the conference was over. When I next saw Eileen, I told her, without mentioning Irene, that I felt we had been seeing too much of each other, that our relationship had been getting too intense, which it probably was, and that I thought we should cool it and not see each other for a while. She later told me she had not been too concerned because she was convinced that if I was the right one for her, the Lord would bring me back to her. Which he did. The relationship with Irene lasted only a few weeks, until the middle of October, when I went to Eastbourne for a weekend to see her at her college. In short, she jilted me. But not long before Christmas, the young people from Hornchurch Baptist came to Elm Park to take our Friday evening YPF meeting. And who should be singing in the choir but Eileen? I think we spoke briefly after the meeting, just polite conversation, but it was enough to arouse my interest in her again. So I sent her a Christmas card, and she replied by sending me one, and enclosing this short poem. I do believe that God above created you for me to love. He picked you out from all the rest because he knew I'd love you best. I had a heart so warm and true, but now it's gone from me to you. Take care of it as I have done, for you have two, and I have none. Not the best poetry in the world, but it touched my heart, and I wrote to Eileen. I still have a copy of that letter, asking if she would like to resume our relationship. And from January the 2nd, 1958, hardly a day passed without our seeing each other. Next time, more about Eileen, and then how I came to receive the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Till then, God bless you.